I'm a researcher. I study architecture, construction timelines, urban planning, the mundane mechanics of how cities got built, official records, newspaper archives, building permits, the paper trail that tells us who built what and when and how. That's what I do. That's what I've always done. But I started noticing something. Small things at first. Inconsistencies. Dates that didn't quite line up. Construction speeds that seemed improbable. And the deeper I looked, the more those small inconsistencies began forming a pattern that stretched across continents, a pattern that suggested our accepted timeline of architectural history might be missing something significant, or perhaps concealing something, the possibility that these grand structures weren't built at all during the periods we're told they were, that they were already there, inherited, repurposed, claimed. This is what I found. It started with the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, 1893. The official story is well known. Daniel Burnham and a team of architects built an entire neoclassical city in Jackson Park, over 200 buildings covering 600 acres, in roughly 2 years. Massive structures, ornate facades with columns, statuary and sculptural details that would make Renaissance masters weep. Electric lighting throughout, an integrated rail system. All of this, we're told, constructed between 1891 and 1893. 2 years. I looked at the photographs, not the famous overview shots everyone knows, but the construction photos. Or rather, what few construction photos exist. And here's where it gets strange. There are almost none. For a project this massive, the photographic record of the actual construction process is remarkably sparse. We have images of the finished buildings, we have images of demolition afterward. But the middle part, the scaffolding, the thousands of workers, the daily progress, minimal. The official explanation says these were temporary structures built of staff, a plaster and fibre mixture, built quickly, demolished quickly. Nothing mysterious here. But that explanation collapses when you examine the details. The Palace of Fine Arts alone required intricate moulding work, massive Corinthian columns, detailed friezes depicting classical scenes, the kind of ornamentation that took European craftsmen years to complete on a single cathedral. Yet we're expected to believe thousands of these elements were fabricated, transported and installed in months, not years, months. All while Chicago was simultaneously expanding its regular infrastructure, housing a growing population, and dealing with the typical chaos of a rapidly industrializing city. Where did the craftsmen come from? Where did they go afterward? Or, and this is where the evidence begins to point, were they not builders at all, but renovators? Were they merely cleaning, restoring, adapting structures that were already standing? The labour question haunts this story. To build something of this scale in this time frame would require tens of thousands of skilled workers, plasterers, sculptors, ironworkers, electricians. These aren't unskilled labourers, these are master craftsmen. Yet the employment records from this period show no unusual influx of such workers into Chicago. No massive recruitment drives, no documentation of where this army of artisans came from or where they dispersed to once the fair ended. But if they weren't building from scratch? If they were simply revealing what was already there, hidden or buried or forgotten? That changes everything. And that's where the Columbian Exposition becomes impossible to ignore. Because this pattern, rapid construction of impossibly ornate buildings with sparse documentation, repeats. It repeats with unsettling precision. San Francisco City Hall, Paris Opera House, the Capitol Building in Washington, D.C., Legislative Palace in Montevideo, Uruguay. Look at these buildings, study their facades, the consistency of style, the sophistication of the engineering, the sheer scale of the ornamental work. And then look at the construction timelines. The Paris Opera House, designed by Charles Garnier, is particularly instructive. We're told it took 14 years to build. 14 years sounds reasonable for such a structure, doesn't it? Until you read the actual construction accounts, work was frequently halted. There were funding issues. The Franco-Prussian War interrupted progress. An underground lake was discovered beneath the site, requiring extensive water management systems. With all these delays and complications, how did they still complete the intricate ceiling frescoes, the elaborate gilt work, the marble grand staircase with its complex balustrades, and the hundreds of sculptural elements? The timeline only works if the actual construction proceeded at an impossibly rapid pace during the brief periods when work was active. Unless the work wasn't construction at all, unless it was excavation, uncovering, restoration of something that predated Garnier's involvement entirely. The deeper I went into the records, the more I found this same pattern. Construction projects that faced documented delays, funding shortages, and technical problems, yet somehow delivered finished buildings of breathtaking complexity on schedule, or ahead of schedule. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. But construction speed is only part of the puzzle. The materials themselves present another problem. Many of these grand structures from the late 1800s and early 1900s feature granite foundations, marble columns, bronze fixtures, and intricate stonework that would challenge modern fabrication methods. Yet we're told they were built during an era when the primary construction method was still horse-drawn carts and hand tools. The Salt Lake Temple in Utah provides a perfect case study. Official construction dates, 1853 to 1893. 40 years. That sounds reasonable, doesn't it? 40 years to build a massive granite temple in the middle of what was then a desert settlement. Except the temple required approximately 360,000 cubic feet of granite. This granite had to be quarried from a site 20 miles away, transported by ox-drawn wagons, initially, carved into precise blocks and assembled into a structure with walls 9 feet thick at the base, featuring elaborate spires, detailed stonework, and sophisticated interior finishes. The mathematics become problematic. Even at the later end of construction when rail access was available, the sheer volume of stone, the precision of the cuts, the complexity of the assembly, it strains credibility. This wasn't rough-hewn fortress construction. This was precision masonry requiring master stonecutters. Where are the records of the quarrying operation? Where are the employment ledgers for the hundreds of stonecutters needed for such work? Where are the tool inventories, the equipment manifests, the supply chain documentation? Sparse, fragmentary, often missing entirely. Or perhaps these records don't exist because the work being done wasn't what we're told it was. Perhaps they were adapting existing foundations, clearing away debris from structures that had been buried, abandoned, or deliberately concealed. This raises a simple but critical question. If these buildings were genuinely constructed during these documented periods, why is the paper trail so incomplete? Construction projects generate mountains of documentation: contracts, material orders, payrolls, inspection records, accident reports. For projects of this magnitude, we should be drowning in records. Instead, we find gaps, curious absences, documentation that begins mid-project or focuses almost exclusively on the final stages. Why would documentation emphasize finishing work while omitting foundational construction, unless the foundations were already there? And here's the strangest part. This documentation gap appears globally, not just in American projects, not just in European projects. Everywhere these grand neoclassical and baroque structures appear, the construction documentation follows the same pattern: detailed finishing records, sparse foundational records. Why? Let's pause and consider the geographic scope of what we're discussing. Between roughly 1850 and 1920, we see an explosion of remarkably similar architectural styles across the globe: neoclassical government buildings, baroque theatres, grand train stations with massive arched ceilings, ornate exhibition halls. These structures appear across multiple cities in North America, South America, Europe, Asia, Australia in Melbourne and Sydney, Africa in Cape Town and Cairo. Same architectural vocabulary, same construction techniques, same ornamental language, same scale and ambition. The official narrative is that this represents the global spread of Western architectural education and the French Beaux-Arts tradition. Architects trained in Paris brought their knowledge worldwide. Imperial powers exported their architectural preferences to colonies. The Industrial Revolution enabled rapid construction everywhere simultaneously. But this explanation requires us to accept an extraordinary level of coordination. Think about the logistics. We're talking about an era before international air travel, before instantaneous global communication, before standardized manufacturing could ship identical components worldwide. Yet somehow architectural firms on different continents were producing buildings with such stylistic consistency that they appear to follow a unified design language. Not similar, not influenced by, virtually identical in their approach to proportion, ornamentation, and spatial organization. The evidence suggests something much larger than mere cultural exchange or colonial influence. It suggests either a level of global coordination that shouldn't have been possible with 19th century communication technology, or these buildings share a common origin point that predates the official construction timeline, that they emerged from a single, older architectural tradition, a civilization that built on a scale and with a sophistication that we've inherited but refuse to acknowledge. And that's where the official explanation breaks down completely. Let me be very clear about what we don't find in the historical record. We don't find a clear evolutionary path. In legitimate architectural development, you can trace the progression. Romanesque leads to Gothic. Gothic evolves into Renaissance. You see experimental phases, you see transitional buildings where architects are clearly figuring things out. You see failures, you see regional variations based on available materials and local building traditions. But with these grand structures from the 1850 to 1920 period, they appear fully formed. No awkward prototype phase, no regional trial and error period, just sudden appearance of master-level execution across multiple continents simultaneously. As if the knowledge was already there, as if the templates, the techniques, the proportional systems were being copied from something that came before. We don't find adequate training institutions. To build these structures required thousands upon thousands of master craftsmen, stonemasons, plasterers, sculptors, metallurgists. Where did they all train? The documented architectural schools of the period couldn't have produced this many qualified professionals. The apprenticeship systems couldn't have scaled that quickly. Yet somehow, there were enough master craftsmen available in dozens of cities worldwide to execute these complex projects simultaneously. Or were they craftsmen at all? Were they labourers, workers, people tasked not with creating, but with uncovering, cleaning, restoring what was already standing beneath accumulated earth and debris? We don't find the supply chains. Marble from Italy, granite from regional quarries, specialised glass, bronze fixtures. The material requirements for just one of these buildings would have been enormous. Multiply that by hundreds of structures being built within decades of each other, and you need industrial scale quarrying, metallurgy, and transportation infrastructure. Yet the mining and transportation records from this period don't reflect operations of sufficient scale. Not quite enough quarries, not quite enough freight capacity, not quite enough raw material extraction to account for all this construction. The numbers don't add up unless most of the materials were already in place, already part of structures that had stood for far longer than we're willing to admit. Here's where it gets truly strange. Many of these structures incorporate construction techniques that, according to our accepted timeline, shouldn't have been available yet. Or they accomplish feats that would challenge modern construction methods, using supposedly primitive technology. The dome of the US Capitol, for instance. Cast iron, weighing 8,909,200 pounds, assembled 288 feet above the ground. Official construction, 1855 to 1866, during the Civil War. While the nation was literally at war with itself, while resources were diverted to military production, while labour was scarce. Somehow this massive architectural undertaking proceeded and completed successfully. The engineering tolerances required for such a structure are extraordinary. Each iron piece had to be precisely fabricated to fit with hundreds of other pieces. The stresses had to be calculated with extreme precision. Too weak and the dome collapses, too heavy and it crushes the supporting structure. This requires sophisticated mathematical modelling and metallurgical consistency. And it was all done with 1850s technology. Supposedly. Or was the dome already there, and what we're seeing in the historical record is merely the restoration, the reclamation, the reappropriation of existing infrastructure? Consider the foundation of the Palace of Westminster in London, built on reclaimed marshland beside the Thames. The official construction dates, 1840 to 1876, tell us this was accomplished using steam-powered pumps and Victorian engineering prowess. But here's the thing. Modern ground-penetrating surveys of the site reveal foundation work of extraordinary sophistication. Not just adequate for the building above, overbuilt to a degree that seems excessive for what Victorian engineers would have known about soil mechanics and load distribution. Why would they have built foundations far stronger than their contemporaneous engineering knowledge would suggest was necessary? Unless they didn't build them at all, unless they knew something we assume they didn't know, unless they were working from specifications that came from somewhere else, or unless, and this is the hypothesis that emerges from the evidence, they were renovating or repurposing foundations that already existed. Foundations laid by hands we've been taught to forget. One more pattern bears mentioning, perhaps the most unsettling pattern of all. When these massive construction projects ended, when the exhibitions closed and the fair buildings were demolished, when architectural fashion supposedly shifted toward modernism, there's a strange silence in the cultural record about what was lost. The world's Columbian Exposition buildings were demolished in 1893 to 1894. Hundreds of structures of stunning beauty reduced to rubble in a matter of months. The official reason, they were temporary, built to be torn down. But read the accounts from people who visited the fair. Read what they wrote about those buildings. The sense of awe, the descriptions of perfection in form and proportion. These weren't just plaster mock-ups to people who saw them. These were architectural masterpieces. Yet when they were demolished, there's remarkably little protest. No preservation movements, no wealthy patrons trying to save even one building. No architects arguing that these structures should be maintained as examples of the art. Just acceptance. Agreement that yes, these should all come down. Why would people accept the destruction of what they themselves described as perfect? Unless they understood, on some level, what these buildings really represented. Unless these structures were evidence of something that couldn't be allowed to stand. The same pattern appears with world's fairs across the globe. San Francisco, 1894. Buffalo, 1901. Seattle, 1909. Enormous architectural complexes built at tremendous expense, then demolished almost immediately with minimal public resistance. Why? If these represented the pinnacle of contemporary architectural achievement, as we're told they did, why was everyone so willing to see them destroyed? Unless people knew something, unless there was an understanding, unspoken but widely shared, that these buildings were never meant to be permanent, not because they were poorly constructed, but because they were evidence of an inherited architecture, evidence of a previous civilization's achievements being passed off as contemporary accomplishments, evidence of something that needed to be managed, controlled, eventually erased. The evidence suggests not just architectural mysteries, but coordinated institutional memory management, a deliberate obscuring of what came before. So where does this leave us? With questions, important questions that the official timeline struggles to answer. How were hundreds of ornate structures built across 6 continents in a remarkably short period, using construction methods that shouldn't have been capable of such speed? Or were they built at all? Were they inherited, excavated, restored, and claimed as new construction? Why do these buildings share such consistent architectural language despite being separated by oceans and continents? Because they emerged from the same source, the same forgotten builders, the same lost civilization. Where did the massive workforce of skilled craftsmen come from, and where did they disappear to? Or were they simply maintenance crews, cleaning teams, workers tasked with making old structures look presentable, rather than creating new ones? Why is the construction documentation so fragmentary for projects that should have generated extensive records? Because the real work wasn't construction, but concealment of the truth about these buildings' origins. How were engineering feats accomplished that challenge our understanding of period-appropriate technology? Because the technology wasn't from that period at all? Why was there so little resistance to demolishing buildings that contemporaries described as architectural marvels? Because these buildings told a story that couldn't be allowed to persist. And perhaps most importantly, what came before? Because that's the question at the heart of all this. Not how were these buildings built, not when were they built, not by whom, or under which architectural movement, or using which specific construction methods. Number. The real question is, what architectural tradition did they inherit? What knowledge system were they drawing from? What civilization left these structures behind? And why have we been taught to forget it? What came before our accepted timeline begins? I still study the buildings. I still examine the photographs. I still read the construction accounts, searching for answers in the gaps between official explanations. And the gaps are there, undeniably, consistently, across continents and across decades. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision, sophisticated structures appearing fully formed, rapid construction with sparse documentation, global stylistic coordination suggesting a single source, and then sudden abandonment and demolition of these architectural approaches in favour of modernism. Something happened. Something that left behind buildings we're still using today, while insisting on a construction timeline that doesn't quite hold up under scrutiny. Something that required explaining away an entire civilization's worth of architecture by attributing it to a few decades of Victorian engineering. Perhaps these buildings are remnants, leftovers from a world we're told never existed. Perhaps what we call construction was really excavation. Perhaps what we call architectural genius was really architectural inheritance. I don't claim to know what that something was, but I know the questions are valid. I know the inconsistencies are real. And I know that once you start seeing these patterns, the missing records, the impossible timelines, the global coordination, the technological paradoxes, the possibility that we inherited rather than built, you can't unsee them. The official story is incomplete, at minimum. The evidence suggests it may be deliberately incomplete. And somewhere in those gaps, in those architectural silences, in those rushed demolitions and fragmentary records, there's a different story. A story about who we were before we became who we're told we are. A story about what we found buried beneath the earth, what we claimed as our own, what we've been taught to credit to our recent ancestors rather than to a civilization that came before. A story written in stone and bronze and glass, if only we learn to read it. The buildings are still standing, many of them, waiting, patient, silent witnesses to a history we may have forgotten, or been encouraged to forget, or never fully understood in the first place. The question isn't whether something's been hidden. The question is, what exactly and why? Were these structures ours to begin with, or did we simply inherit them from those who came before?